from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, and it has been quite a week, to say the least. I have to tell you, I'm looking at a lot of things. I'm going to not talk about the meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister. Some comments were made out of that, not the least of which is normalizing relations, I should say, setting up diplomatic status with North Korea, which has caused a rather vocal response in South Korea, as you can well imagine, and also mentioning that North Korea is a nuclear power, which again brought up a very vocal response from South Korea. But I am going to talk about what's probably dominating the news, and that's what happened this week. I'm going to talk about the proposal that President Trump had put out on what to do about Gaza. And I will kind of refer to it because he kind of did too. In his press conference where he announced it, he basically said, he kind of called it maybe turning into like a Riviera or something. So I'm going to call it the Gaza Riviera plan. And this is unusual, to say the least. There's a lot of issues there. Anyway, to kind of go back, the week of February 3rd, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu kind of did a tour de force visit to Washington, D.C. And he came in and he met with White House advisors that deal with Gaza, Middle East policy. Apparently had some very constructive meetings that came out of that. And then he eventually met President Trump, and they had some discussions that apparently was a very cordial meeting, went along quite well. And at the end of all this, they had a sit down at the very beginning, which I have to tell you, most presidents in the past might be a few minor comments to the press, and then it was mostly a photo op, and then they would go in for substantive meetings. President Trump doesn't operate like that. He actually ended up having a long, involved discussion, taking a lot of questions from the press right up front, which I was kind of curious about because I was like, well, he kind of did his press conference before he actually, or his final press conference before he actually did the event. And then they had meetings, and then they did the press conference. And you know, part of my back of my mind, I'm like, so what is he saving for the press conference that he didn't already talk about with the press? And he was saving something all right. So anyway, he goes in there with the press conference. And let me just start out before I get into the Gaza Riviera plan, mentioning something else that came out. All right. First off, met with President Trump. Then the next day, I think on Friday, he met with Speaker Mike Johnson. They had a very substantive meeting, and he met with a number of people in Washington, D.C., and so Bibi Netanyahu did. And so a lot of it came out. One of the things that came out is that the White House is putting sanctions on the International Criminal Court. For reference, neither the U.S. nor Israel are signatories to the International Criminal Court. One of the reasons we're not a signatory to the International Criminal Court is because the court, we're concerned, the U.S. does stuff all over the world. Our military forces are deployed worldwide, and the International Criminal Court has shown in the past that sometimes they're a little quick to go after some of the larger powers, shall we say, such as the U.S. They're a little quick to, if we do something, any member of the International Criminal Court can file a complaint and say, well, they violate international law, whatever it is. And we basically, as a rule, do not want to expose our forces, our uniformed service members, our personnel worldwide to this international criminal court proceeding in another country, is because we're concerned that they will be wrongfully charged and could be wrongfully convicted. And we don't want to send our personnel off to do things, off to serve a sentence in some foreign land, because it kind of violates some of the precepts under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, things like that. So we've been very reluctant to do that over the years. And I guess you would have to say the International Criminal Court would have to show much more institutional strength overall before you'll ever see the U.S. join in. Israel, of course, has not been a signatory. Part of the issue is because of the UN's constant resolutions that condemn Israel and the vitriolic that they have had from the international community against Israel literally ever since they began. So they're not going to subject their forces, their personnel to the International Criminal Court as well. So we're not signatories. All right. However, we do a lot of things on the international scene. We move money a lot of different places. And what President Trump did was place sanctions on the International Criminal Court, which target individuals, institutions, but basically has the potential to significantly degrade the effectiveness of the court. And of course, having the court under U.S. sanctions also reduces its legitimacy, its standing worldwide, because now the U.S. has pointed its finger right at the criminal court. Now, one of the things that the White House cited was the arrest warrant for Bibi Netanyahu. He wasn't the only defense minister at the time. And what he described as essentially a false equivalency. I don't think he used that quite. I don't remember if he used that term exactly. But it was a false equivalency in that it holds Israel as being equivalent to Hamas. Israel being a nation state, being a democracy with a functional election system and everything else, and then Hamas being essentially a terrorist group, if you will, an insurgent group, paramilitary, but a terrorist group more than anything else. Of course, they're also the perpetrators of the horrific attacks on October 7th, among other things. And so that was one of the big issues that the U.S. cited in these things. You may recall the criminal court, the international court, also has a arrest warrant out for Putin. And Putin has traveled to other countries, to include at least one country that was a signatory to the ICC, and they did not arrest him, did not send him to the court, albeit that country, Mongolia, is a little limited because on one side they got China and the other side is Russia. And as I pointed out on the air at the time, I'm not quite sure how they would have sent Putin to the International Criminal Court if they had arrested him, because there really wasn't a physical way to move him from Mongolia to the court without going over either Russian or Chinese lands, neither of which, or going through their airspace, neither of which are going to allow that to happen. So anyway, the court, very symbolic. Occasionally they do some really good things, particularly if they're looking at, authoritarian, despotic dictators around the world. They have been known to do some good things. But anyway, in this case, the U.S. is basically squared off against the court. And what this does is it really brings into focus the concept of international courts of justice. Can they actually function? Can they be a neutral arbitrator in the international system? And that, of course, reflects into the validity of international law. And one of the reasons you have international law, you have these large treaties, is to avoid a planet where nation states kind of, act as imperial nation states of centuries back, if you will. Might makes right. And that's not what we want to see. We want to see some rules on the international system. And so that's one of the issues that came out of this, was that we filed sanctions against the International Criminal Court. Separately in that press conference, what got a lot more notoriety was that President Trump mentioned that the U.S. could rebuild Gaza and that we would take ownership of it, and that the Palestinian population there would be resettled elsewhere while this rebuilding program was going on. In that discussion, he mentioned that they could move to Egypt or Jordan. All right. I have to tell you, when I first heard him say that the U.S. we take ownership of Gaza, I perked up and I'm like, did I just hear that correctly? Did he just say we, as in the United States, would take ownership? And by the way, when you say ownership and you're a nation state in the international system, ownership kind of infers sovereignty, that we would take sovereign ownership, sovereign control of the Gaza Strip. I had never heard that before. And the Gaza Strip is actually controlled by Israel. Now, Israel, because it seized it in the 67 war, it is considered essentially a occupied territory, as are the West Bank considered occupied territories. One can have a lively discussion about Israeli sovereignty over the certainly both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and certainly with the current war in the Gaza being a rather bit of an exception, it has been run as an autonomous self-ruled territory in the Gaza Strip, albeit they elected Hamas, a terrorist group, to run it. So that's another issue. That's why we have this war to begin with. But with all that said, it was a little bit strange. Basically, it was interesting when I was reading some of the reactions by some of the journalists that were in the press conference. They too had initially thought that he had misspoken. And if you looked at the physical reaction of Bibi Netanyahu standing next to him, my initial response was that he was caught a little off guard that he said that. My initial interpretation was that he probably heard that that was that the president had misspoke as well. All right. That turned out not to be the reason why he had that reaction. I think he was just a little bit surprised the way that President Trump had unrolled that in that press conference or put that out there. And many have noted that they had some pictures of President Trump and his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, nearby. And her body language, but particularly her facial expression where she was looking, indicated that she was completely caught off guard by this comment. This was not something it doesn't appear to have been particularly well staffed, if you will. And I don't think there was complete consensus, certainly within the White House, or certainly not within the rest of the diplomatic community, not the intelligence community. I didn't get the sense. I got the sense this is something that he thought was a pretty interesting initiative, and he put it out there. He apparently had talked about it with Bibi Netanyahu, because Bibi Netanyahu knew about it. But after he had kind of put this out there, he went out to say kind of what this meant. And then Bibi Netanyahu gave his comments, which sort of reiterated the same message, although he was a little bit circumspect in his terms, talking about, this shows, kind of the bold initiative, or bold thinking or whatever of President Trump, that he throws these things out there. And he talks about historically that he would throw things out there that everybody would dismiss, and then, or he'd make an assessment on the situation that others would dismiss. And then over time, people go, oh, he was right. All right. So I thought it was kind of an interesting way that Bibi Netanyahu kind of put that out there. It's like, hey, he's leaving himself a little wiggle room on this to kind of back off later on, is what it sounded like. But then he did come out and sort of endorse this concept as something to look at. All right. Now, there's certainly a lot of problems with this. First off, it's not clear legally under international law, certainly. And that's why I kind of mentioned the ICC thing earlier, because it shows the degradation of international law. But I'm not quite clear how an occupying power, Israel, could cede the sovereignty of the territory it occupies to another country, particularly one that isn't even in the region. I mean, the U.S. has no contiguous borders, if you will, anywhere in the Middle East. All right. We have forces out there, but we don't have, if you look at the Gaza Strip, you got the Mediterranean. So there are countries, in the Mediterranean that are out there. That would seem rather odd, but it's not impossible that they could look at something like that. One time the Ottoman Empire, which is eventually became Turkey, controlled that area, if you want to go back historically speaking. But then you have, it was Egyptian territory at one time. Ironically, while Egypt ruled it, there was never a discussion about it becoming a Palestinian state. I will say that. Or for that matter, while Jordan ruled the West Bank, there was never a discussion about the West Bank ever becoming a Palestinian state. All right. Only when Israel took control of those areas was there all of a sudden this discussion of establishing a Palestinian state where these places are. So I just kind of want to point that out for historical context. But part of this proposal was that they would displace the residents of Gaza, or the Gazans, if you will, Palestinians that live in Gaza, that they would displace them to another country, Egypt. Now, Egypt's been very clear. They don't want the Palestinians there. And honestly, if you spent time in the Middle East, you realize that, look, all of these countries in the Middle East took a lot of Palestinians in, after 1948. In 1948, the famous Nakba, if you will, where Palestinians, Arabs that lived in what's now territory in Israel, moved by, if you listen to the Israelis explain it, they say they kind of picked up and left for the most part. They weren't forced out. If you listen to the Palestinians version, they were forced to leave their lands and they lost control of their lands. I'm sure that the ground truth is a little bit in between those two, because part of it at that time was that all the Arab states, around there were determined to destroy Israel. They were determined to, quote, drive the Jews into the sea. Right? Their goal was to destroy the state of Israel. They viewed Israel as an artificial entity cooked up by European Jews, if you will, these Zionists that believed, that the Jews should repatriate this land or whatever, in Israel, and that they rejected certainly Zionism. I mean, they're Arab states, they're Muslims, and they rejected that whole Zionist philosophy there, and they saw it as basically a footprint of European colonialism. In fact, while the European nations were basically turning over after World War II, sometimes not quickly, but eventually turning over their colonial territories worldwide at a rather prodigious rate, here you had a new colony, as they would see it, being established by Europeans in Palestine. And Palestine was a name for that territory, if you want to go back. I mean, that's actually, if you look at the British, I think they called it the Palestine Mandate or whatever. So it wasn't a new name there, but it was there. So when the Palestinians who lived in Israel left, a lot of them were with the full expectation that eventually the Arab League would get together and force the Israelis out, that they would come back and take their territory. They would probably take their land back, but they'd also probably take the land that was owned by Jewish residents that lived in the area too, because they would have been forced off their land by this invasion by the Arab League. Anyway, that never happened. A number of attempts, not due to want of trying. Some big wars, 1967. The last big one being Yom Kippur in '73. Major wars, but it never happened that they were successful in pushing the basically destroying the state of Israel. What happened was quite the reverse. That Israel would get into these wars, and then they seize the initiative early on, or in the case of Yom Kippur, they got pushed way back, and then they reorganized and pushed back the other direction, and were very successful in seizing a lot of additional land. All right, so that kind of sets the framework there. The other thing too, which is very big and weighs heavily in the minds of the in Israel, is that the Palestinians originally, if you want to go back to World War II, had strong ties with Nazi Germany. And of course, that also weighed in the minds of certainly the British that controlled that territory. And the Grand Mufti of Palestine actually was, I believe, a 2-star general in the SS of Germany. And this was a German plan, if you will, to basically try to destroy it. And there was a little subterfuge sort of thing where they were planning on doing these big attacks using paramilitary, kind of what we call hybrid warfare type stuff today. So that's very much in the minds. And then there were some rather prominent former SS, former Nazis, I believe in the 1950s and into the 60s, particularly hired by Egypt, that were basically trying to build this Palestinian terrorist movement, if you will, to attack Israel as a means of kind of what we would again call today hybrid warfare. So that's very much in the minds of the Israelis as they're looking at the Palestinian movement, and they do not forget that. Now, the Abraham Accords have been very successful overall. A number of different countries, not the least of which certainly the UAE recognizes Israel, and they normalize relations with them. The one that's really outstanding, everybody's been looking at Saudi Arabia, and they've hinted that they want to normalize relations, but they also want to see a Palestinian state established. They have dedicated themselves to that. And this statement by President Trump about this idea of forcibly displacing the Palestinians in Gaza and then going in and doing this redevelopment thing, which when you use the term Riviera, kind of denotes that you want to turn it into a tourist destination or something like that, and a little ambiguity on how many would the Palestinians return. And it was a little ambiguous. Well, some, but it'd be an international sort of place or something like that. Certainly in the minds of the leaders of Arab states, but more importantly, the populations of these Arab states around, they're looking at this as saying, okay, this is Nakba 2. They're going to force the Palestinians out. Under the Geneva Convention, this would be considered ethnic cleansing when you forcibly displace people from their historic lands. And so it's on the streets of Arab capitals. This is not a very popular thing, and it has been roundly condemned all around, which is another way of saying that despite the fact that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia would like to normalize relations with Israel, and that could really change the power dynamic of the Middle East. This has kind of thrown a bit of a monkey wrench into that whole thing with this idea. All right. And by the way, even though Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, monarchies have to listen to their people. Uneasy sets the crown, if you will. And they have to listen to what people are saying within their own countries. You know, the King of Jordan has to do this. Certainly the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has to do this. All of these monarchs throughout the Middle East have to listen to what people are saying on the street. So they got to be very, very much attuned to what's going on. Now, one of the interesting things that almost was a side thing that popped up was that a number of these states have kind of tacitly recognized there's no way, this is an Israeli position, there's no way Hamas can be in charge of Gaza when this is all done. A number of the Arab states, key Arab states, have kind of said, yep, we agree with that. Hamas cannot be in charge. I thought that was actually very telling. So there is recognition that Hamas cannot be in charge. So one of the reasons talking about forcibly moving everybody out there is to give Israel a free hand to go in and clean out all the Hamas elements. Hopefully, but of course the fear of Egypt and Jordan, not the least of which is they don't want these 2 million Palestinians suddenly moving into the borders. They feel they have enough Palestinians living in the borders, is that they're going to come in there and Hamas fighters and Hamas ideology, which comes from the Egyptian Brotherhood, which the current leadership of Egypt worked really hard to get rid of that Egyptian Brotherhood control of Egypt. They don't want that. So they all recognize Hamas cannot be in there. They just don't want to see the Palestinians coming into their country. All right. Now, could a rebuilt Gaza become a nascent Palestinian state in the future? I think that's something they're going to have to explore. It's not a new idea. I heard it years ago from one of the smartest Marine Corps intelligence officers I know, who's basically an expert, I should say. He's a foreign area officer. He's an expert in the Middle East. And certainly he articulated this some time back. What would that Palestinian state look like? Again, I don't know, but I'd say they might want to look at how the U.S. works with the compact states of the Pacific, where they are, sovereign states, independent republics, but the U.S. is responsible for their national defense, national security needs, includes homeland security as well in a lot of areas. And I've spent a lot of time working in those countries on the homeland security side of that. So that might be a model that they could take a look at. All right. Now, did Trump throw this out as a negotiating point? That's been discussed widely as well. I got to tell you, there's a danger of negotiating in public like that. When you negotiate in public, it makes it a lot harder to walk back. If it's in the room and you throw that out there, people can walk out of the room and say, you said that, but it's not the same thing as hearing you say that. So there is a challenge there. On the other hand, when you put that down as a marker, then everybody else has to respond to it. That's a thought. It could be that, that they put it out there as a marker. And frankly, if you look at one of the challenges with Gaza is that they can't figure out where to go. Nobody's coming up with really great solutions. Israel, in all honesty, does not have a great solution for what to do with Gaza. So they're going into the negotiations for phase 2, phase 3. The question becomes, where do you go? The full withdrawal of the Israeli forces. Okay, well, who's in charge? Well, right now, as we've seen with the hostage releases, who's in charge is literally the Hamas, which is the folks that can't remain in charge. And Hamas is really not inclined to negotiate its eventual destruction, if you will, the end of Hamas. There really isn't a great way to go. The Arab states around there have not come up with a truly viable solution. They have not proffered to send in peacekeeping forces. They have not proffered to come in and help Israel basically eradicate Hamas from the Gaza Strip or anything like that, certainly. So with that, there isn't really a great alternative proposal out there. This one is definitely out there, but one can say, they kind of threw that out there, and it does give them a point to negotiate from. And I have heard former Trump officials who are familiar with the way that he does international stuff. They say it looks a lot like the way he does business negotiations. Not surprisingly, because he spent pretty much his entire life doing business negotiations. that he throws these things out there and he'll put them down as kind of a marker, if you will, to negotiate from. One of the great criticisms of President Obama was that he would go into a negotiation having thought through all the issues very clearly, and he would throw down as our initial starting point where we wanted to end up, which is kind of a failure of negotiation 101, because the other side saying, okay, that's where you're starting. Now we're going to kind of get more out of this. And so many times we'd end up with some very unsatisfactory results from our negotiations because, frankly, we put down what we thought was our final and fair offer, and that's just not how those negotiations went. So, obviously, Donald Trump does a little bit different way of doing that, so that may be part of why he threw that out there. All right? So it could be just a gambit. All right? It's a methodology that's used in this. The reality is that no one's going to put money into rebuilding Gaza, and I mean no one, none of the Arab states. You're not going to see Saudi money going in there. You're not going to see certainly UN money going in there. You're not going to see Israel put money in there. The U.S. isn't going to put any resources in there until Hamas is gone. And so the current status quo is I don't really see where it's going. They can't go to a phase 3 with rebuilding because there's no way to figure out how Hamas is gone. The other problem is, and this was actually brought up very clearly, it's a disaster area. What buildings are still standing are structurally unsafe. There is ordnance, which means unexploded bombs and other ordnance and other things that permeate that entire region. So it has to have this basically explosive ordnance disposal program. Some would say akin to a mega demining program, but it's much bigger than that because you have rocket warheads, if you will, along with indirect fire weapons, mortars, all sorts of stuff that's just littered all over the place that they need to go through. Basically, they got to raise almost all the buildings in the Gaza Strip and then rebuild it anew. There is no solution. Where do you put the 2 million people? There is no solution. And within Gaza, they don't want to leave. They're afraid of another Nakba. They leave, they never get a chance to go back. So they don't want to leave. But the question is, what do you do? All right. Now, the Arab countries, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Arab League, all of them have rejected this concept outright. Every day there's more vociferous rejection of this concept. That's been very clear. Many European countries, Great Britain, France, others have also rejected this concept outright. It is something of an affront to international law to say we're going to go in there and just take sovereignty for an area like this. On a number of different things, they've rejected it. Obviously, interestingly, one of the few times I've seen in the last few years where China, Russia, and most of the European countries are all in agreement. This is not a good idea. And so China and Russia have also tossed that out. Other countries around the world have also rejected this idea. It is something that if another country did it, if China did it, and that's actually caused a lot of concern. Something like this adds a little bit more credence, if you will, to the idea of China certainly militarily taking over Taiwan. And so there's been a lot of concern that what's happening here, what the U.S. is talking about with Gaza, actually almost gives an indirect green light to China to go into Taiwan militarily and seize it. And that's not a message we want to send. So there's a problem that it also reflects on Russia going into Ukraine and taking over Ukraine. And it kind of echoes some of the same things that Russia has said in terms of its rationale for taking over Ukrainian territory. Not directly, but very indirectly it does. So there's some big concerns on what this signals across the international system. With all said, it's a bold concept, to say the least. It's a very pragmatic concept, which is move all the people out, clean it up, rebuild it, and then let people move in. But it's not quite that simple. There's a lot of, and certainly from a business standpoint, that makes a lot of sense to do something like that. For Israel, it makes a lot of sense because for them, the U.S. would control that territory, which means that there is no threat to Israel in any way if the U.S. is controlling the ground. But it'd be very difficult. I don't see a way that could be really pulled off because I think that there'd just be nothing but international condemnation across the board. And it would cause huge problems with us in every other realm worldwide. But it is a bold idea. And at some point, Hamas has got to get out of there. They got to figure out what to do with Hamas. they're going to have to figure out what to do with all the people, all the Palestinian residents, while they're doing this clearing and rebuilding program. There is no solution for that that's been forwarded. So it does throw out at least an idea of what can be done. And it was very correctly pointed out by President Trump and others that there's no water system, viable water system. There's no utilities. There's no sanitation system. There's nothing. There's no electricity. The country is basically, whatever was there is destroyed. And so that is a correct assessment. So the question is, what do you do? Even though this option has a lot of problems on a variety of different levels, political, legal, ethical, moral, the problem is there isn't another really big option or another big proposal out there to counter it. And it may be all along that was the intent of throwing this out, was to force everyone to really, to basically stand up and come up with something that is a viable, realistic alternative to something like this. So we'll see. We don't know, but there's a lot of strategic implications. And certainly the strategic risk, if you will, of doing this is significant. But the strategic risk of not doing something is significant as well. And I think that's what's kind of being worked out, albeit very much on the public stage. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode of STRAT. If you go on YouTube, go to Hal Kempfer TV, and you can see my pretty much almost daily media appearances. Basically interviews, segments where I do analysis on a variety of things around the world. And anyway, thanks, and looking forward to our next STRAT discussion.